This paperwork, a field of cotton. An auction block, a name that was never chosen by the person who carried it. If your family name is Washington, Jefferson, Jackson, or one of 12 others you're about to hear, then you're walking around with a living piece of American slavery attached to you every single day, in the one place nobody can ever take away from you, your own name. For generation after generation, black families in America were told the same, a painful thing, that their history was gone forever, burned up in courthouse fires, lost somewhere on a slave ship in the middle of the ocean, wiped out on purpose so nobody could ever trace it back. But something has shifted. That very name, the one that was placed on your great-great-grandparents against their will, has become the exact thread that modern DNA science can now grab hold of and follow. And once it starts pulling on that thread, it does not stop at some old plantation in Virginia. It keeps going all the way across the Atlantic Ocean, back to a specific people, a specific region, a bloodline that the slave trade spent 400 years trying to bury and forget. Here are 15 surnames connected to slavery, and here is what DNA testing has uncovered about each one. Before we go further, if you see your own family name anywhere on this list, take a second to subscribe and turn on notifications. This channel is built around one single purpose: helping black families find their way back to the people who were taken from them. Every week, we dig further into old records, into African regions, into the actual science that is quietly reconnecting families 2 centuries after they were torn apart. Subscribe now and let us search for your roots together. Let us begin with something almost nobody was ever taught in school. When an enslaved African arrived off a ship in a port like Charleston or New Orleans, that person already had a name, a real one, given by a mother, tied to a specific village, tied to a specific people. A name carried forward through generations like a family treasure, and the very first thing the plantation system did to that human being was erase it. Enslaved people were written down in ledgers as property, sometimes with nothing more than a single first name if they were fortunate, and right beside that name sat a dollar value, priced the exact same way you would price livestock or a sack of grain. This was never an accident. When you take away someone's name, you take away their sense of belonging. You sever the thread, and once that thread is cut, finding your way home again becomes almost impossible. When freedom finally arrived after the Civil War, close to 4 million formerly enslaved people suddenly needed a last name. A surname was required to sign a labor agreement, required to register as a voter, required to place a newspaper notice searching for children who had been sold away years earlier. So people made choices. Some chose the surname of the man who had once claimed ownership over them, not out of any affection, but because that surname was the only paper trail that might one day reunite a scattered family. Some chose the surname of a founding father, a bold and defiant statement aimed at a country that had promised freedom and equality, but had delivered almost none of it. Some invented a brand new name from nothing at all, and some picked one simple word that captured hope or liberty or a fresh beginning. What almost none of them were able to do was recover the actual African name that had belonged to their family before enslavement. That original name was gone. So keep this in mind as we move forward. The surname sitting on your birth certificate right now is not a clue pointing toward Africa. It is a fingerprint left behind by slavery itself. It leads you to a plantation, not to a homeland. For roughly 150 years, that plantation was where the search simply stopped, right at the edge of the ocean, with no way to cross over. But here's the part that has completely changed the game. When you take that surname fingerprint and combine it with a DNA test, together they can carry you across that ocean. The surname gets you as far as the plantation. Your blood carries you the rest of the way home. There's a wall that nearly every black family researching their history in America eventually runs straight into. Historians and genealogists have a specific term for it. They call it the 1870 wall. So, the 1870 census was the very first one that listed formerly enslaved individuals under their own full names as actual human beings, rather than as property counted alongside farm animals in some other family's household records. I want to pause here for a moment, because there's always a point in videos like this where the full research goes further than what fits into 20 minutes. The complete picture, every detail DNA science has uncovered, all of it is available in a linked resource in the description below this video. Take a moment to check it out before you keep watching. Now step back just one more census to 1860, and in most cases, your ancestors disappear entirely. No name at all, just an age, a gender, and a simple tally mark on something called a slave schedule, filed under someone else's household. That wall, that specific year, is where the paper trail runs completely dry for millions of families, and for 150 years, that was simply where the search had to end. There was nothing left to search and no door left to try. This is precisely the wall that DNA testing is finally able to climb over. Let us go through the list. Number 15, Carter. It sounds like a straightforward English surname, and it is originally an occupational name for a man who drove a cart for a living. But in the American South, it took on an entirely different meaning. Carter families spread across Virginia, the Carolinas, and Georgia, often tied to some of the largest tobacco plantations in the colonies, and the enslaved people who lived and worked on that land carried the Carter name into freedom by the thousands. Growing tobacco was punishing labor all year long, and the plantations built around it were among the oldest in the country, which means the surviving records reach back further than almost anywhere else. If your Carter ancestors came out of the Chesapeake region, your documented history likely runs deep into Virginia soil. When Carter descendants take a DNA test today, results frequently lean heavily toward West Central Africa, the area old shipping records referred to as Congo and Angola. That is not a coincidence at all. It represents the single largest source of enslaved people ever brought to the Americas, and it keeps surfacing again and again in the DNA of families who never suspected the connection was there. A name that once meant a man with a cart in England, a bloodline tracing back to the Congo River. Both belong to you at once. Number 14, Robinson. This name simply means son of Robin, brought over from England and Scotland long before it ever touched American soil. It became one of the most widespread surnames among black families across the Mississippi Delta and throughout the Cotton Belt, where entire communities of Robinsons worked the same stretch of land generation after generation. Robinson descendants who test their DNA are often directed toward the Bight of Biafra, the coastal stretch now part of southeastern Nigeria. That region sent an enormous number of Igbo people into bondage, so many that their cultural fingerprint, their foods, their expressions, their traditions can still be felt echoing through black communities across the American South today. Most people carrying the Robinson name have no idea this connection exists. The surname says England, the DNA says Africa. Both statements are true at exactly the same moment, and that contradiction, living inside one single family, tells the entire story of who we are. Number 13, Mosley, sometimes spelled Mosley, an Old English surname pulled from a specific place, a field or piece of farmland that once belonged to somebody. Among black American families, this name clusters tightly across Alabama, Georgia, and the Carolinas. What makes Mosley especially interesting is how firmly rooted these families remained after slavery ended, staying in the same counties for generation after generation instead of scattering across the country. For anyone researching their family tree, that is a genuine gift, because it means local records, church registers, county filings, and land deeds have a much better chance of surviving together in one place. When the DNA results come back, Mosley descendants frequently trace to the Gold Coast region, modern-day Ghana, homeland of the Akan people, master goldsmiths and traders whose kingdoms ranked among the wealthiest in all of West Africa. If your grandmother's people were Mosleys, who never left the county they were freed in, that same stubbornness, that refusal to move, is exactly what makes your African origin traceable today. Number 12, Harris. This surname is everywhere. It is one of the most common last names in the entire country, and among black Americans, it runs especially deep through the Carolinas and Virginia. Harris descends from Harry, a medieval English first name, nothing more complicated than that. But the way black Harris families cluster along the coastline tells its own separate story. That coastal stretch of Carolina and Georgia is Gullah Geechee country, home to a culture that preserved far more of its original African roots than almost any other community in North America, largely because the isolation of the Sea Islands allowed those traditions to survive intact. DNA results from families rooted in that region point repeatedly toward the Windward Coast and the rice-growing regions of Sierra Leone. Enslaved people from those specific areas were deliberately targeted and taken because they already possessed deep knowledge of growing rice in flooded fields, and that stolen expertise built the massive fortunes of low-country plantation owners. Your surname is Harris. Your ancestors may very well be the reason an entire regional economy existed in the first place. Number 11, Coleman. A name meaning either a charcoal maker by trade or a follower of a saint named Coleman, depending on which side of the ocean you trace it from. Coleman families spread throughout Tennessee, Kentucky, and across the Deep South. What stands out most about Coleman is how frequently the name appears in some of the earliest Freedom-era records, specifically the Freedmen's Bureau files created in the 1860s. It was generated the moment slavery legally ended, and that timing matters enormously, because those files represent one of the only places where the newly freed were documented under their own names, in their own words, at the exact moment of emancipation. That kind of paperwork is invaluable to a researcher. When Coleman descendants take a DNA test, results commonly point toward Senegambia, the region surrounding modern Senegal and the Gambia, home of the Mandinka, the Wolof, and the Fula peoples. If that region shows up strongly in your results, you are looking at ancestry connected to some of the very first people ever taken in the entire transatlantic slave trade, right at the start of a 400-year wound. Number 10, Gaines. A sharper and far less common surname, and that rarity is exactly what makes it a dream for genealogists. Gaines traces back to a Norman French word, and in America, it became attached to specific slaveholding families in Virginia and Kentucky, whose records happen to have survived unusually well. Here is why that matters so much. When a surname is rare, there are fewer families to confuse with one another, fewer duplicate entries cluttering the census, and cleaner documentation to follow from one generation to the next. A Gaines descendant can sometimes trace a family line further back than almost anyone else on this entire list. DNA results from Gaines descendants often reach back toward Nigeria and the Yoruba people, one of the largest, most thoroughly studied, and most richly documented ethnic groups in all of West Africa, with a history of kingdoms, cities, and artistry stretching back 1,000 years. A rare surname, strong surviving records, and a clear DNA signal, all lining up together at once. Before continuing, remember the resource linked in the description, because everything mentioned in this video is only a piece of something far larger. Every story this channel covers has a deeper layer underneath it, and that fuller picture, the complete DNA findings, and everything the research actually uncovered is sitting right there waiting for you. Go take a look, then come back and keep watching. If your surname is Gaines, you may be much closer to a real breakthrough than you have ever allowed yourself to believe. Number 9, Booker. If this name sounds familiar, it should. Booker T. Washington, born into slavery and later rising to become one of the most influential black figures in American history, carried this exact name. Booker comes from an Old English word describing someone who copied books by hand, a scribe, which is a quietly ironic origin for a name now closely tied to a man who fought so hard for black literacy. Among black families, this surname runs through Virginia and the surrounding states. It is not a particularly common name, and once again, that rarity works in your favor when researching it. Booker descendants frequently discover West Central African ancestry in their results, connecting straight back to that same Congo and Angola region, responsible for the largest single wave of enslaved arrivals, a rare surname resting on top of a deep, traceable African connection. That combination is exactly what turns a generations-old dead end into a wide-open door. Number 8, Banks. A surname that simply meant someone who once lived along the bank of a river. Among black Americans, Banks families concentrate heavily throughout the Deep South, in Mississippi, Alabama, and Georgia. What makes Banks genuinely fascinating is how consistently the name appears across specific black communities, so consistently that when researchers map it out over time, it actually traces the real migration paths, the exact routes families walked and traveled out of the rural South and into the great cities of the North during the Great Migration. The surname itself becomes a trail of breadcrumbs. Banks descendants who test their DNA frequently see strong results from the Bight of Benin, the region surrounding modern Benin and Togo, home of the Fon and Yui peoples, and the birthplace of deep spiritual traditions that survived the crossing and evolved into Vodou traditions across the Americas. Your surname points to a riverbank in Mississippi. Your bloodline may point to a sacred shrine in West Africa. The distance between those two places is the exact distance slavery forced your family to travel. Number 7, Freeman. This one stands apart from every name mentioned so far. Freeman was never the surname of a slaveholder. It was a statement. When emancipation arrived, thousands of formerly enslaved people flatly refused to carry any surname connected to their bondage, and chose Freeman instead, a word that declared exactly who they had decided to become now that the choice finally belonged to them. If your family carries the Freeman name, there is a real and moving possibility that your ancestors made that choice deliberately, a quiet act of defiance written permanently into your family identity, a message sent forward through time to reach you. Because this surname was chosen freely rather than inherited from a plantation owner, it appears scattered widely across the entire map. DNA results from Freeman descendants spread across nearly every major region of West and Central Africa, from Senegal all the way down to Angola. The surname itself tells you very little about which plantation your ancestors escaped from, but it tells you everything about the people who survived it, and about the very first free decision they ever got to make for themselves. Before moving to the final 6 names, it is worth pausing to explain how any of this is actually possible, because this part quietly changes everything. In 2020, researchers working with a major DNA testing company published one of the largest studies ever conducted on this exact history. They combined DNA results from more than 50,000 people on both sides of the Atlantic with actual historical shipping records from the slave trade. Sit with that for a second. The very same manifests that once listed human beings as cargo, reducing your ancestors to a number and a price, have now been used to build a map leading their descendants back home. Between the years 1525 and 1866, an estimated 12.5 million people were forced onto those ships. Only around 10.7 million survived the crossing. The rest died in the hold, in the darkness, out at sea. In their absence, the specific people who never made it to land is written into the genetic record just as clearly as the ones who lived. That study confirmed what historians had long suspected. that most African American people carry deep roots in West Central Africa, the Congo and Angola region, precisely where records show that around 5.5 million people were taken from. But the study also revealed something historians had not fully expected: a far larger share of Nigerian ancestry than the shipping records alone could ever explain, with particularly strong connections to the Yoruba, the Isan, and the Igbo peoples. Why the mismatch? Because the horror did not end with a single ocean crossing. Enslaved people were repeatedly bought and sold between colonies, moved from the British Caribbean into the American South again and again, long after the transatlantic trade had officially ended on paper. Your DNA remembers a journey that the written record tried its hardest to erase. This is exactly why a surname alone was never enough to lead you home, and exactly why the surname combined with DNA finally is. That same research uncovered another truth, a much harder one to put into words. Within the United States, the genetic record shows that African women contributed far more to the modern gene pool than African men did, badly out of proportion to the actual numbers of each brought across the ocean. That imbalance is neither a mystery nor an accident. It stands as the genetic shadow of generations of assault, of enslaved women forced to bear children who were then immediately counted as someone else's property, more wealth added to a ledger. Your DNA carries the physical evidence of what was done to your family. But turn it around, and it carries something else entirely too. It carries proof of who endured it, who survived it, and who kept on living anyway. Every single person alive today descending from this history comes from someone who was meant to be erased completely and simply refused to disappear. Number 6, Brown. One of the most common surnames in the entire English language, and among Black Americans it is simply massive, spread across every state in the South and well beyond it. For a long time, that sheer commonness made the surname feel almost impossible to trace. Too many Browns scattered too widely with too little unique documentation to separate one family line from another. But this is exactly where DNA testing cuts straight through the confusion that paper records never could. Brown descendants test into nearly every region on the map, though a large share land squarely within that same West Central African heartland alongside the Carters and the Bookers. So if you have ever looked at your own last name and felt it was too plain, too common, too ordinary to ever lead anywhere meaningful, understand this clearly. The surname is the haystack. The DNA is the magnet that finds the needle hidden inside it. Number 5, Johnson, meaning son of John, and one of the most widespread surnames across America regardless of background. But among Black families specifically, it stands as one of the most common names in the entire country, running thick through the deep South before flowing north into industrial cities during the Great Migration, into places like Chicago, Detroit, and Cleveland. Johnson descendants who test their DNA commonly find strong ties to the Bight of Biafra and the Igbo people of southeastern Nigeria. That very same overrepresented Nigerian signal the major study identified in its data. So many Black Johnsons carry that identical ancestral root that it stops feeling like coincidence and starts feeling like a homecoming simply waiting to happen. If your surname is Johnson, understand that you are far from alone in this search, and that is not a weakness at all. It is exactly the reason an entire community of Johnsons can eventually find its way back to the same origin together. Number 4, Williams. Here the numbers become genuinely staggering. Williams ranks among the most common surnames in all of America, and according to census figures, more than 700,000 Black Americans carry it, more than any other single surname on this entire list. It descends from son of William, brought over originally from Wales and England, then planted across the southern states in numbers almost too large to fully picture. That massive scale cuts both ways. It makes tracing any single Williams family line genuinely more difficult through paperwork alone, simply because so many identical names crowd every record. But it also means Williams' descendants form one of the largest testable communities in the entire country, an enormous web of distant cousins waiting to be connected. When they test their DNA, results scatter across all 4 major African regions at once, forming a living portrait of the entire slave trade contained inside a single surname. If your last name is Williams, understand this: your family is not some small footnote inside this larger history. Through sheer size alone, your family is a central part of the history itself. Number 3, Jackson. According to census data, 53% of every American named Jackson is Black. Sit with that number for a moment. A surname shared with a former United States president. A name stamped across cities and streets all over the country. And more than half of every single person who carries it descends from someone who was once enslaved. The Jackson surname runs thick through Mississippi, Alabama, and the Carolinas. DNA results from Jackson descendants reach broadly across West Africa, with especially strong signals toward the Gold Coast and the Bight of Benin, toward the Akan, the Fon, and the Yu peoples. There is a deep and bitter irony buried inside this fact. that a surname once tied to a slaveholding president would become, only a few generations later, a name carried overwhelmingly by the very descendants of the people that system tried so hard to erase from existence. But that irony also carries a kind of quiet victory inside it, because that is precisely what your ancestors accomplished. They took a name that had been forced upon them and, through sheer survival alone, made it entirely their own. Number 2, Jefferson. This stands as the second blackest surname in the entire country. 75% of everyone named Jefferson is black, 3 out of every 4 people, and you already know exactly where this surname originates. Thomas Jefferson, the man who wrote the words that all men are created equal, held more than 600 human beings in bondage across the course of his lifetime. Among them was a woman named Sally Hemings, and the descendants of the people he enslaved carried his surname out of Monticello into freedom and out into the wider world beyond it. When Jefferson descendants take a DNA test today, many find themselves reaching back toward both West Central Africa and the Nigerian regions. The very name signed at the top of the Declaration of Independence is now carried 3 times out of 4 by the direct descendants of the exact people that celebrated document quietly failed to include. If your surname is Jefferson, understand exactly what that makes you. You are living, breathing proof of the gap between what this country claimed about itself and what it actually did. Number 1, Washington, the blackest surname in America. There is truly no other way to describe it. Census records counted more than 160,000 people carrying the surname Washington, and 90% of them are black, 9 out of every 10. No other common surname in the entire country comes anywhere close to that number. It is the surname of the very first president, a man who inherited enslaved human beings before he was even old enough to vote. After the Civil War ended, freed black families claimed the surname in numbers that still stun researchers today. Some took it to lay claim to the promise of a nation that had never once kept its word to them. Some took it simply because it was their paper trail, that one thread connecting them back to family. In the state of Tennessee alone, more than 200 people freed from a single plantation walked into freedom carrying the Washington surname. When their descendants take a DNA test today, the results swing open a door that the old ledgers slammed shut a century and a half ago, pointing clearly back across the Atlantic toward the regions that built the American South using stolen hands and unpaid labor. If your surname is Washington, you carry the single most concentrated symbol inside this entire story. A name that was forced upon your family, then deliberately chosen by them, then transformed into something its original owners could never have imagined. Proof of survival. So here is the honest truth, and it matters more than any single name on this entire list. Your surname does not tell you your clan. It never could. A surname traces the man who once claimed to own your ancestors, or it traces the exact moment they finally claimed themselves. It works as a signpost, not as the final destination. What actually carries your people, your true origin, across the centuries is your DNA. Blood does not lie. It cannot be burned in a courthouse fire. It cannot be sold off at auction. And when you place the 2 pieces together, the surname pointing toward a plantation and the blood pointing toward a homeland, you end up holding something that the generations before you would have wept simply to touch. A map back home. People are using this exact map right now, today, to find living relatives in Nigeria, in Ghana, in Angola, in Sierra Leone. Not vague, general regions on some chart, but actual relatives sitting in actual villages, sharing actual measurable segments of shared DNA. The family that slavery violently tore apart is slowly, carefully being stitched back together. One test, one match, one surname at a time. And you might be sitting there right now wondering how a simple cheek swab inside a plastic tube could possibly reach back across an entire ocean and 4 full centuries. It comes down to something called autosomal DNA, the DNA you inherit from every single branch of your family tree all at once, not just one narrow line running down the middle. You share measurable, countable segments of it with everyone you are related to, and the more you share, the closer that cousin actually is. So when someone in Lagos, or Accra, or Freetown takes that very same test, and their results land inside the same database as yours, the system is able to see the exact segments the 2 of you hold in common, and it can estimate precisely how you connect to one another. That is how a man living in Atlanta suddenly discovers a 3rd cousin in Nigeria he never even knew existed. It is not a guess. It is not a feeling. It is a shared piece of the very same ancestor, still sitting quietly inside both of your bloodlines, patiently waiting to be noticed. The regions listed in your results tell you where your people originally came from. The living matches tell you exactly who they are. And if you have never taken a DNA test yourself, understand that timing matters more than most people ever realize. The oldest members of your family, your grandparents, your great aunts, your great uncles, carry DNA and memory that no database on Earth will ever be able to replace once they are gone. Their results reach 1 full generation closer to the original source than yours ever could. So please do not wait on this. A name half remembered off an old headstone, a story shared at a family reunion, a single test taken while someone is still alive to take it. Anyone in your family could end up being the thread that finally unravels the whole knot. The hardest part was never the science itself. The science already exists right now. The hardest part has always been believing there was still something left out there to find. There is. So if any of these 15 surnames belongs to your own family, understand exactly what you're holding on to. It is not a mark of shame. It is a thread, and that thread leads somewhere real. The people who were stolen were never actually erased because you are here right now, alive, watching this, and their blood is alive inside you too. And for the very first time in 400 years, the science finally exists to follow that thread all the way home. If this video opened something up inside you, subscribe and stay with us, because next we are breaking down exactly how to read your own DNA results region by region, so you can stop guessing and start finding the specific people you actually descend from. Your ancestors survived the unsurvivable so that you could sit here today and ask this one question. Now let us go find the answer together.